Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. Our show, Think Tank, is the PBS program on ideas. But are human beings the only creatures that think? What about other animals? To find out, we came to the Think Tank exhibit at the National Zoo, a program designed to study the cognitive abilities of animals. Later in the program, we will head back to our studio for an in-depth discussion on animal intelligence.
I think we can recognize humans as the fifth species of great ape.
Do animals think? If so, what do they think about? And what can we learn from them? The topic before the House, animal intelligence. This week on Think Tank. I am with Lisa Stevens, who is the curator of Think Tank at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. You're from Think Tank, I'm from Think Tank. Welcome to Think Tank. Right. What are you all doing here?
Well, this is an exhibit that's very unique for a zoo. We are looking at the subject of animal cognition, animal thinking. And the exhibit is as much about the subject as it is about the process, the scientific process of investigating thinking. And what we're really hoping is that we narrow that gap between us and them and really get people to see that other animals have the ability to think.
Okay, what is thinking involved?
And our definition involves three things.
Right.
It involves image, which is the ability to make a mental picture of something. Intention, which is basically a goal, and flexibility. Now, flexibility is real important because that's the aspect of the definition that one can look at by looking at animal behavior. So if an animal has an image and an intention, and it sets out to accomplish something, if the first plan fails, this ability to come up with maybe a second or a third plan, plan A, plan B, is what's really the critical part of our definition. Now, we have lots of examples of behavior in Think Tank. We look at a broad range of behaviors, and it's real important to discern what behaviors are based on instinct or are genetically hardwired from trained behaviors, from innate, flexible thinking behaviors. We're looking at thinking behavior in three areas. We're looking at tool use, language, and social behavior here in Think Tank. These are the three areas that traditionally scientists have used to gain insight into thinking behavior. And we're looking at a variety of species, not only orangutans, Sulawesi macaques, a type of monkey, hermit crabs, archerfish, and leafcutter ants.
Let's go on to the next area.
Let's take a look at the tool area.
All right, great. Lisa, give me some examples of animal tools.
We use a lot of examples from chimpanzees. Chimpanzees in the wild are very resourceful at finding food and using tools to obtain food. And they show a lot of flexibility in their tool use. For example, there are populations of chimpanzees that use a stone tool in order to crack nuts that they can't crack on their own using their teeth or their hands. And they actually have anvil and pestle stones that they use in order to crack these nuts. And they show incredible flexibility and skill in how they use these tools in order to obtain this very rich food resource.
If they move from one area to another area, do they carry their tools with them?
They carry their tools with them, or they store their tools and they go back and they seek them out in order to further harvest these nuts.
So would that fulfill the requirements that we talked of for intelligence?
Most definitely. They show lots of flexibility. They show the ability also to modify these stone tools in order to have exactly the right stone to do the job. We started out conceptually with a definition of thinking,
And then we moved over to the tool section to see how that interacted with that idea of thinking. And what are we doing here with the macaques? What are we looking for?
Social behavior is one of the newest areas of study when it comes to animal thinking. Really going out and looking at the dynamics that occur in a social group of animals. These macaque monkeys live in a group in which they have to balance cooperation and competition in order to meet their daily needs. Two areas that we find very exciting in this field is the evidence of tradition among animals and the evidence of innovation, animals which depart and do unusual things. There is a very famous group of macaque monkeys in Japan on Koshima Island who, when provisioned by the scientists with sweet potatoes and also rice, one particular individual began to take the rice and the sweet potatoes and wash them in the water. We think that this accomplished two things. One is that it separated the sand very nicely from either the sweet potatoes or the rice. Perhaps it also made it more efficient to eat the rice because the rice would float on the surface of the water. But the second thing perhaps is it provided some salt.
It provided
the salt water maybe perhaps improve the flavor of the provisioned food. We really don't know why this particular animal did it, but what we know is once she started, this behavior then was learned by her offspring. And now when you go to Koshima Island, every individual in the population does it.
Lisa, this was a fascinating tour, and I learned a great deal. And we all salute think tanks, whether they're in television studios or in zoos. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
It's great. Appreciate
Thank you for
it.
coming.
You bet. As promised, we are back at our own think tank studio to further discuss animal cognition and the research being done in this field. We are joined here by Robert Shumaker, biologist and coordinator of the Orangutan Language Project at the National Zoos think tank, Sarah Boysen, director of the Comparative Cognition Project at Ohio State University's Chimpanzee Center, James Olds, neuroscientist and director of the Krasnow Institute for Advanced Study at George Mason University, and Eugene Linden, author of the recently published book, The Parrot's Lament and Other True Tales of Animal Intrigue, Intelligence, and Ingenuity. Ladies, gentlemen, thank you for joining us. This is not a field that I purport to be a great expert on, so maybe we could start out just going around the room, starting with you, Rob, who you work at the other think tank.
That's
with
right.
Lisa Stevens.
That's right.
We saw. Let's go around the room. Tell me what you're each working on briefly, just so our audience gets a little view of what we think we're talking about.
Okay, to the point, I'm working with orangutans, one of the species of great apes, and I'm studying their mental abilities in regards to learning a language made of abstract written symbols. Then that language is a platform for me to pose and explore a number of other questions about their general mental abilities.
Okay, Sarah.
Well, my ape of choice happens to be the chimpanzee, and while
His is the orangutan,
the
and
big
yours is
orange,
right.
shag carpeting.
Right,
yeah.
right.
And I work with chimps, have for about 25 years, and my interests really are in a whole range of conceptual and cognitive capabilities in chimps. I'm interested in cognitive capacities, and to look at that, we've been exploring things like numerical competence, that is, counting skills, the chimp's ability to recognize the relationship between a scale model of a room, for example, in the real room, and more recently we've been looking at chimpanzee natural vocalizations, an innate species-typical collection of food barks, for example, or screams or whatever, and we're looking at the information content of those.
Okay, Jim?
I'm interested in the cell biology of learning and memory, and that's across a number of species. But for me, what has been intriguing in my own line of research is understanding the sequence of molecular events that may subserve animal intelligence.
And are they the same molecules that perform memory functions in humans?
We think so. Certainly there's a direct line in terms of these molecules from animals as simple as sea snail all the way to a mammal as advanced as a rodent or a rabbit. So we have, and these same molecules are present and enriched, in fact, in the human brain, particularly in the parts of the human brain that subserve higher learning and memory.
Now, Gene Linden, you are not one of them.
I'm not one of them.
What do you do?
Well, I got interested in the question of cognition and language when I heard about the ape language experiments nearly 30 years ago, and I thought, gee, that's interesting. Chimps aren't supposed to be able to do that. And one single anecdote sort of led me to do this book, The Parrot's Lament, when I heard about an orangutan that escaped from a zoo in Omaha way back in the 1960s, at about the time that the apes were doing the language experiment. This orang was hiding a wire in it between its lip and gum, using the wire to pick a lock, get out of its cage, then hiding the wire again. And it did this 3 times at least before it was caught. And they discovered how it was getting out and where it was hiding the wire. And that involved tool use and tool making, keen powers of observation to understand how the locking mechanism worked, deception, a whole suite of higher mental abilities. And it was doing it despite the best attempts of its keepers to keep it in the cage. So there was no possibility of cueing or imitation. And it occurred to me, maybe animals do their best thinking when it serves their purposes and not necessarily that of a scientist. I began talking to zookeepers and trainers, scientists, veterinarians, people who deal with animals on a daily basis, and the floodgates just opened, and I got all these stories that seemed to reveal all sorts of higher mental abilities involving trade and barter and games and humor, deception and such.
Do you all generally believe that animals are smarter than most people think they are? Is that what might unify you?
I think most people think animals are smart. It's just a very difficult question to prove.
I think it's an awkward question in a way. I think that most people have experience with dogs and cats and domestic animals, and I think a lot of the time those animals get too much credit in terms of what they know or understand, not to take anything away from them, but it's easy to project your ideas on your pet.
Don't take anything away from
I'm not taking
from
anything,
Maggie, my dog.
Nothing away from your dog, I promise. But
Okay.
I think that the animals we work with, great apes in particular, get the short end of the stick in terms of people's perceptions. And I think they have a tremendous capacity for understanding and learning and thinking and whatever you want to call it.
I agree with you, Rob, on some things. I think the lay public does empower animals with a great amount of capabilities, more so than the scientific community. Okay? But the scientific community is looking for rigorous empirical evidence, data. Show me the data that unequivocally will demonstrate some of these kinds of complex things that Eugene mentioned, like deception, et cetera.
You've all mentioned, without me even bringing it up, controversy, that there's an argument going on here. What's the I didn't know there was an argument going on about animal intelligence. What's the argument?
The argument is always, I mentioned the word cueing earlier. The very first ape language experiments posited that they could understand symbols and maybe manipulate these symbols and use them in a productive way. Then critics referred to a horse called Clever Hans back at the turn of the century who seemed to be able to do math. And his owner would say, "What's 3 and 4?" and he'd tap his foot and stop at 7. And it was a wonder.
Eugene.
Not go to 34, but go ahead, right, yeah.
Well, in any case, then a psychologist looked at this and did an experiment where he blindfolded the horse, I think. When the horse could not see the owner, it was a dunce at math, and it turned out that the owner would visibly relax when he got to the right answer. Ever since then, and so it seemed he was doing math, but really he was just watching his owner, and I think Hans was pretty smart, to figure that out if he was going to get a meal out of it.
Yeah, I think it was actually the case that if whoever was asking him the question, or they didn't know the right answer, that somebody else, as long as the person who knew the correct answer was interacting with the horse.
Within eyeshot of the horse, right.
And
I mean, you can make the case, as you started to make, that too requires a certain level of intelligence to be able to read a visual cue of relaxation.
But it's not arithmetic,
it's not what they said,
computation.
Right.
But ever since then, there's been this. Clever Hans has hung over every single experiment that's ever been done with higher mental abilities, and people look for the most obscure opportunities for imitation and cueing.
Is this an argument between hard scientists and even harder scientists? And in other words, I mean, most everyone would agree that many animals at least have some intelligence. Is that the argument?
I think neuroscience is changing. Ben, I think that 20 years ago, 10 years ago, the reductionists, the folks in neuroscience and psychology who are interested in understanding intelligence from the lowest building blocks, the atoms, if you will, would have been very offended by this notion of animal intelligence, and we're constantly crowing about cueing artifact in these types of experiments. But I think neuroscience has changed. And one of the key things that's changed about the field is that we now understand that it is not simply enough to break down a complex mechanism to its simple watch parts, the little gears, and understand how a watch works. That in fact, a good deal of what our brain does in terms of producing mind and intelligence is a result of these vast cell assemblies, arrays of nerve cells interacting together like a symphony orchestra. So,
and producing big chunks of complex behavior.
Absolutely.
Right, that you can't understand by looking at D1 and D2 dopamine receptors. Doesn't tell you about that.
And the simplistic notions that were very popular in my field at least a decade ago, and maybe even less than a decade, are by the by.
Still in my department.
There's a philosophical and religious dimension
Absolutely,
to the debate.
it really is.
We don't want to share the world with other.
Right.
Intelligence gives us special rights in nature. It makes us, the sort of pinnacle of the cosmos, and what it's sort of. I think the phrase is the divine trauma.
So is it?
Well, I mean, there's still the carryover of some, scale with humans up here in level of complexity, right below the angels. Right. When in fact, all species that are alive today is part of the biological continuum, which includes us. It's this way. It's a horizontal schema, and we've ticked away at all things that we thought of, or at least historically have been unique for humans. Used to be man, the tool user, because we spoke of it that way, not humans, man. Well, Goodall reported over 30 years ago that chimps were using tools. Okay, so we'll correct it. Now it's man, the tool maker. Well, tool modification of all sorts have been demonstrated by chimpanzees and other species. So that wasn't any good. Well, when the ape language work started, oh my word. There was such an uproar in the academic community because would we dare to say that there was a species on the planet that shared even a proto-language-like capability? Big controversy. Okay, then we even have someone like Frans de Waal suggesting that there are the rudiments of morality. I got the same thing in my work with it's not really counting if a chimp is doing it, just because it's not a human. So we always up the ante on the definition of what's human, and there's one last holdout right now. And Eugene talks about that a lot. And when you look at the sort of the distribution of stories that he shares in his book, then you'll come to see what this last thing is, and that is the ability of humans to attribute mental states to others. That is, I can empathize and think about how you must be feeling right now because I'm not stopping talking and you probably want to. At any rate, that ability to attribute a mental state.
When I want to start talking, you will hear me talking. Go ahead, that's right.
But that's sort of the last new holdout that involves the level of consciousness that humans and chimpanzees have. And it's a very rich area in developmental psychology looking for this notion of theory of mind in kids.
Do you think there is any difference between chimpanzees and human beings?
Yes.
The brains are
I think humans are a lot smarter. We get quarter of our cardiac output goes to the brain. Less blood goes to the brain than a chimp. The chimp's brain's smaller by any ratio. I mean, we've been optimized for intelligence. I like to use the analogy of if you're going to have a continuum, like we may command the heights of Mount Olympus in terms of cognitive abilities, but animals are arrayed along the slopes depending on how intelligent they need to be. And they're not at the bottom all looking up. It's more like...
Eugene, wouldn't you say that it's a matter of degree rather than a qualitative difference that separates?
And that's been the controversy for a long time.
I don't think anyone would argue that humans are not distinct in some ways. But I think it's important to note that those ways are not all things that we're particularly proud of. We're also the only species that I know of that has committed genocide. So the kinds of things...
Some of those apes commit murder.
Yes.
Occasionally.
But that's not genocide.
No, they have warfare.
Well, they don't
murder,
have the
conflict,
tools
they
for, I mean,
romanticize it.
it's, okay, it's not genocide.
And I think the intentions are very, very different. I mean, and aggression is normal in every species, certainly normal in humans. But when we talk about humans being special and unique, there's two faces to that coin. There are things that are not particularly great about our species as well, and we don't see those in other species. But I think we share much more than we differ, and if we were going to be honest and upfront about it, I think we can recognize humans as the fifth species of great ape. And I think what Jim said is entirely consistent with that, that the differences between humans and other great apes are differences in degree, not differences in kind.
Is that what you're finding in the language project that you're doing at the National Zoo here, at Think Tank, at the zoo?
Well, I certainly don't think that we're intending to pose that as our research question or our main hypothesis. We're not. I think what we can contribute are answers to individual questions that we pose, collect data, and answer, the same way Sally moves along in her research. And I think what we find over and over and over when we look at all of these good quality science projects is that apes are able to do all of these different abilities that everyone's been mentioning. We know that they are intelligent. We know that they are thinking. We know they have cognitive complexity. I think there's very good evidence now that they're able to understand things from a different point of view, or this idea of theory of mind, placing themselves mentally in the place of another individual. That's a tremendously sophisticated
It's something
skill.
that doesn't occur in human children until about 4.
Right, right.
Lisa Stevens was telling me when we talked to her at the zoo about the deceptive qualities of the macaque monkeys,
Right.
and told of an incident where when the alpha male wasn't looking, one of the subordinate males went off with one of the females behind a screen.
Sure.
For the purpose of copulation.
Right.
And the female purposefully didn't make her normal mating sounds,
Right.
lest they be discovered.
Right.
Obviously, I couldn't let this program go by without repeating that sort of an incident.
Well, but it's interesting that
that was, you know, that's pretty intricate behavior. A, you're sort of sneaking off, and B, you're not only sneaking off, but you're kind of covering it
also
up. Again,
surprising
it sounds like Washington. I mean, again, right? It's
But you used the term purposefully. And there's no way scientifically and rigorously in an anecdotal setting in the field to provide support for the use of that term. You don't know what her mental state was. You don't know what she was thinking, and it wasn't an experiment. It's an observation. But they speak to those kinds of issues.
Let me just get into a final area, which unfortunately we have to be fairly brief in, and I can summarize it in a very brief 2-word question. So what? So you're learning all these things about animal intelligence. Is that going to help me in any way, or my children, my grandchildren?
It gives you insight into what being human and having thoughts of grandma, memories of growing up, what that means actually to be human. We gain insight from studying animals that are similar to one another.
What insight have you gained? Give me a for instance.
I believe that, for me, the notion that my own 6-layer cerebral cortex, the wrinkly thing that sits in my brain, engages in the same electrical activity that an ape's cerebral cortex does, or even a cat or a rat. That makes me think of myself as an intelligent animal on a continuum rather than separate from these animals, because I see my brain as being the evolutionary product of those brains.
It's kind of lonely if we're the only smart creature in the universe. I think it's much more comforting to think that there's a lot of other intelligences out there, different intelligences enlivening the world.
Alas, our time for we 5/5 apes has lapsed. Thank you very much, Rob Shumaker, Jim Olds, Sally Boysen, and Eugene Linden. And thank you. At Think Tank, we encourage feedback from our viewers, particularly via email. It's very important to us. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
We at Think Tank depend on your views to make our show better. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1219 Connecticut Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. Or email us at thinktank@pbs.org. To learn more about Think Tank, visit PBS online at pbs.org. And please let us know where you watch Think Tank. This has been a production of BJW Incorporated, in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.